Hey everyone, this is Bathmetrics, and today we're doing episode 2 of my GridSchool series for Bitwig 3.0. Today we're going to cover UI basics and navigation tips. The first tip I have for you though is regarding the Bitwig site itself. If you go to bitwig.com and scroll down and find their promo blurb for Bitwig Studio 3 and click it, and then go way down the page to the bottom where they have some introductory videos. They're slowly building up a series of videos made by Dave Lindenbank of Bitwig. Really great stuff here. If you haven't seen these yet, please, when you're done with this video, go watch these because they're going to show you a lot of nice, interesting things and some other types of useful basics and concepts about the grid. That said, we're going to jump into the stuff I want to show you, which I'm going to cover about 15 different elements that I think are very basic and some useful tips. So first things first is we currently have two grid devices. We have the Poly Grid and we have the FX Grid, and they're almost identical looking. The main differences are that the FX Grid has a mix knob, which lets you mix between 100% dry signal going through the grid and whatever kind of FX processing you may have built on it. So this would be 100% dry, this would be 100% wet, and this would be a 50-50 blend right in the middle at 50%. So the Poly Grid is different in that, this is meant to be an instrument. You build a synthesizer of some sort in here, and it has an output knob, which just controls the total master volume of the entire grid device. In other regards, they're pretty much identical. There is one other small difference though. When you click on the header of the device itself, you get the inspector panel just for the grid device. And this is where you set up your voice handling and other useful things like the basic phase coming in from the transport into the device and how it's subdivided. I'll be talking about phase in a later episode of this series, so don't worry about that right now. But the main difference is if I click the FX Grid, you're going to see this area change. And what's different is this device input right here in the notes section. And I'm just going to briefly mention ahead of time that even though the FX Grid is meant to be audio processing, where you've got your signal coming into the grid and you build distortion or delays or whatever kind of effects you want in here, and then it goes back out again, you can also send note input, MIDI note input into this grid, and you could have some modules that are responding to the MIDI note input and maybe doing some audio processing based on whatever you want to capture from the note input or even CC values. So be aware that even though this is the FX Grid, you do have the ability to select MIDI data from anywhere in your project and use that as input. It doesn't necessarily have to be the note input that's flowing through the actual device. So that's a little different. Whereas the Poly Grid doesn't let you select the note input. The Poly Grid is always picking up whatever input comes into the channel on this particular track. Okay, next thing is when you're working with the grid, there's sort of two ways to visualize it. You can click here, or you can click the usual button to bring out the full pop-up window. But there's also, as with many of the Bitwig instruments like the sampler, if you have your shortcut key assigned to do a pop-out window, you can get a floating undocked version of the window. And this can be handy for a couple reasons, like you could move it to a different screen and blow it up real big and be able to see and work in your grid device at the same time you're looking at your arranger and all your other processing devices. So just remember you have those two modes, and you can control them also with this little button right here, this undock or dock button. Say this will make it undocked, this will make it docked again. Okay, next thing, zooming and scrolling. So one way to move around your grid, if you have a big build, is to just drag this blue rectangle around. You can also hold down Control and move your scroll wheel to zoom in and out. If you let go of Control and move your scroll wheel, you can pan or scroll up and down in the grid. And if you hold down Alt when you scroll, you can pan left or right in the grid. So I tend to use Control and Alt and my regular scroll wheel more often than not to work in the grid. And if you're not sure how far you're zoomed out or zoomed in, you can always click this little button right up here in the upper left. It looks like a magnifying glass with a 1 in it or an eye. And if you click that, everything comes back to its default zoom. All right. The next thing to understand is that you can insert new modules into the grid by dragging them down from the category chooser up here. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to simply right-click anywhere in an empty space on the grid, and then you get these flyout menus. So this is a little more like the easy way to find and build things in Reactor, for instance. So it's the same exact categories, just flyout menus. If you right-click on a module, you get a few useful things. First of all, you can activate or deactivate the module. And I'm just going to take a side trip real quick and say that's kind of tedious to always right-click to activate and deactivate. Sometimes you want to toggle modules on and off really quick to hear what things sound like without it being active and then with it being active. So remember that there is a shortcut called, what is it called? Toggle active, that's it. There's this one specific shortcut called toggle active. And since I came from Ableton, where the 0 key was the shortcut for basically turning things on and off, I've mapped the 0 key in Bitwig to be this particular shortcut. And that means all I have to do is tap 0 to toggle things on and off. Now be aware that if you search for a keyword like deactivate, there is a separate deactivate shortcut, but this only toggles it off. I don't believe it toggles it back on again. I've never tried using it, so you specifically want to check for the one that's called toggle active, okay? Make a shortcut key for that. And the advantage of that is that then you can, select any module and just tap your shortcut key to toggle it on and off. Okay, next thing. This little button right up here, this kind of grid-like blue button, if you need a little more real estate and you don't really need to see these at the moment, you can click this and get a little more vertical screen real estate. Of course, you can always toggle off your device or events editor or whatever grids down here and get a little more vertical real estate that way. And you can also toggle this side off. And if you really want to go for broke, you can toggle off the inspector, but it's pretty useful to keep the inspector up, so I wouldn't recommend that. So just be aware those are various ways you can get more real estate if you need it. It's by toggling all these things. Let's see, next. If you click any one module, the inspector over here, which normally shows you the device inspector, or maybe even if I click the name of the track that I'm on, I can get to the track inspector, come back to the device inspector. But if I click a specific module, I get these module specific inspector things over here. So that's really important because a lot of things that you can't set directly on the module itself are hiding over in the inspector. Like there's some basic clipping and limiting that is available on the audio out, and you wouldn't even know that unless you click the audio out and look at the inspector. A cool thing about the inspector, and to me the most useful thing about the inspector, is that there's all these little at-a-glance waveform displays that sort of help you quickly see whether or not you're getting the kind of signal that you expect to see within the inspector. And it's kind of dynamic. Like you'll see some things that have a label, but there's nothing that they're actually showing, like this gate in, Or over here in the triangle oscillator, I have phase in, pitch in, retrigger in, and there's nothing there. They're kind of grayed out. So what's that about? Let's go grab a sine oscillator, and we're going to drag it down here, and we're going to connect it to the phase input, phase modulation input of the triangle wave. Now there's still nothing showing. If I go over here to the triangle wave, we can see that a phase signal is now coming in from the sine wave. And if I disconnect that, you're going to see the phase signal go dark again, right? So this is how you do frequency modulation in the grid. Let's slow this way down so we get a bigger, more obvious sine wave. So way down. Let's do a 1:64 ratio. So here you can see that this is a sine oscillator. You can see if we skew it, we're seeing the shape change. And we're not looking at this one oscillator and its signal out, which is right here. We're looking at the phase in as this wave shape appears over in the triangle module. So if we turn this up so we're actually hearing the phase modulation, right? So super useful to see these little graphs at a glance because they can help you debug what you're trying to build. Okay, next thing, dragging to replace. So you can take any one module and you can drag other modules right on top of it to just replace them in place. So, you've seen this in the other Bitwig demos, but I'll show it again. I have specific sort of settings here, like a big ratio to set the pitch of the waveform, some skew and fold settings, things like that. And if I were to drag this pulse modulator right onto the middle of this and let go, we have a pulse modulator that's replaced it, but all the settings that are essentially the same between the two modules, it keeps them in place. It actually kept these knobs in the same position. It actually kept the 1:64 ratio. And now we have a triangle wave that's being phase modulated or FM'd by a kind of square wave or pulse wave. Slow it down. Okay. So that's one way to do drag to replace. Now, if we, pick a different type of modulator like the sample and hold and drop it on top, see now we've got this sort of randomized modulation coming out of sample and hold, and we can change the shape of it and at a glance see how strong it is and roughly what the shape looks like and how steppy it is, or how smooth it might be. Like here we can smooth it out and make it more curvy looking. And again, if we come over here, we see that same phase input coming in over here. All right, so let's talk about dragging things onto ports versus, well, let's talk about connecting modules together. So there's two ways to do it. You can drag a new module in, and you can take any output port and connect it to any input port. And if you want to get rid of the connection, you double click. If you want to change the connection to a different point, you can double click and drag and drop on the new port you want to drag it onto, and so forth. Now, a thing to remember, a thing that might confuse you a little bit at first, and I'm going to select both these and just kind of drag them over to demonstrate this. Every module has input ports on the left, output ports on the right. That's very standard. These are always inputs, always outputs. You can take the output of any one module and connect it to multiple other things, right? So you can have multiple cables coming out of a single output port. However, you can only ever have one cable going into a given input port. If I, take this thing and try to hook it up to an input port, you get this kind of behavior. So one very simple and hopefully obvious way to get multiple things coming into a single input port is you have to use mixers for that. You have to use this category of mix things. So for example, if I take and put this mixer here, let me move these all over. And of course, what I'm drawing makes no sense. I would never hook up a chance modulator to an envelope, probably, but I'm just doing it to show you cable drawing. So here I can take, you know, multiple output ports and keep connecting them to the mixer. Let's bring something else in. Oh, I don't want to bring in a noise generator. Let's just bring in another oscillator. All right. Take this output port from the oscillator, connect it up right here, and you can just keep, you know, a lot of these mixer plugins will expand, and there's always a little hidden input port at the bottom, and every time you connect something new to it, this just expands to fill everything up. So mixers are how you can work around the basic limitation of, you know, only one thing can connect to an input port. All right, next up. There's a really cool feature that prevents you from having to draw all of these cables the hard way. Let's put this back here, and let's just connect up another. Let's do it this way. Let's put a mixer here. You can take any module and drag it onto an input port directly or an output port directly. And when you let go, it'll just automatically hook that up in place with the cables intact. Okay, so that's super useful for one. And then we can do things like take a different oscillator and just drop it right on this new, make me a new port on the mixer. And now we have a sine wave that's hooked up to the mixer, and we can start mixing between these two, doing stereo pan and so on. Okay. Now, another thing that's pretty useful, let's drag these over here, is that you have gestures when it comes to hooking things up. So I'm going to put a sawtooth oscillator here. Now what I'm going to do is drag this over and hover on this extra port, but I'm not going to let go of the mouse. And when I finally land on this port right here, I want you to look down at the status bar down here and notice what you see. So here I drag, nothing special on the status bar, but as soon as I drop it onto a port, look what happens down there. It shows me that I have modifier keys with things like attenuate, bend, lag, or value scaler. And if I hold down the appropriate key combination like Control-Shift, and then let go of my key, my mouse button, it'll make the connection, but also drop in a really useful module. Okay, so this is very context-sensitive behavior. Let me delete that module and do it again. This time I'll drag it up and just do Shift. And this time I get a different module. I get an attenuation knob. Okay, so they've really intelligently designed the most common and useful shortcuts for other modules you might want to have in place on a connection. Watch what happens when I drag this same connection over to the input of this envelope over here. When I hover my mouse, I haven't let go yet. See how now the options across the bottom are a blend module, an add module, a mixer module, a merge module, right? A ring modulator. Let's do Alt-Shift and let go. And now we have a ring modulator that's sitting in between the mixer and these two input signals and the envelope, because now we're effectively using the sawtooth to be a modulator for the carrier of the combined mix of our triangle and sine modules. And we can do amplitude modulation on this side or ring modulation over on this side. So just a gesture, just a simple gesture. I didn't have to remember what are all the potentially useful things to hook up in the middle between, you know, any oscillator and the input of an envelope. I don't have to think about it, because if I just look across the bottom, I can see some helpful suggestions for typically useful things for this type of connection between these two specific types of modules. If I'm still holding onto my mouse, if I come down here and drop it onto the gate input, you can see that the selection across the bottom has changed again. Now it's giving me logical operators like a not, or a trigger, or a gate length, or a clock divide. Okay, let's do Control Shift and let go. And now we have a clock divider doing some interesting things, right? So let's get rid of that. I wouldn't really hook up an oscillator to a gate, but just showing you it's very context sensitive. There are dozens and dozens of potentially useful sound design choices when you're making connections, and this little trick of just, drag it over there and see what you get. If I drag it right onto the output, I get a whole different set. And we're back to like blend and add and mixers and multiplies and so on. So really, really useful tip, and that's easy to overlook unless somebody points it out to you. Okay, next. We're almost done. I got about 5 things to cover. Wireless connections. So far we've been drawing cables from output ports to input ports, but there's another way to do connections. Certain types of modules, like our envelope module here, will have your typical Bitwig modulator control on it. And we're going to see that on various things. Not so much oscillators, but certainly a lot of random devices will have it. Envelope devices will have it. LFOs typically will have it, right? So wherever you see these, that's an opportunity to make a wireless connection. So I can take this particular LFO and its shape, which right now we can tell is a kind of a triangle, linear kind of oscillation. And it's unipolar. I can tell by looking at this graph too. If I click this, it becomes bipolar and starts looking like this, okay? So again, at a glance, these are awesome for telling you what's what. But I can take the output of this modulator and, I don't know, control the level of that mixer. And I can also adjust the skew of that triangle. And I can also maybe shorten or lengthen the release of this this module here. And so now we see all the characteristic Bitwig blue overlays kind of demonstrating what kind of modulation might be happening. Okay, so that's useful as you have these wireless connections too. And a certain use case for that I find I use all the time is to take something like a simple value knob. You can take any module that normally just has an output port or an input port, but up here in the I/O section, if you scroll all the way over to the right, there's this modulator out, which I can connect to the value knob. And now I could take this modulator and like adjust the skew of this sine oscillator. And now I have a value knob that I can use to adjust the skew. And then I could do something like take the same value knob and, oops, let's do this. Let's put the fold up here maybe. And let's take the value knob and move it this way. Okay, so now I have one knob that can do multiple things at the same time in opposite directions, same direction, whatever. So this is a really, really useful type of design pattern, is to just use the modulator out, put it on any kind of knob you want, and now it becomes a wireless connection that you can use to modulate all kinds of stuff inside the grid. Okay, next up is the in UI help. Every single module, if you want to understand it, just select the module and press your F1 key. And you get this great, this is where all the documentation for the modules are. You're not going to find any doc in the user guide. It's all right here. Really, really good documentation. And even better, this is still a live workable view of the same module. I can adjust the phase. I can adjust, the starting position of the skew. I can change the ratio of the waveform pitch and so on. And if I close this down, you can see all those changes are in place. So it's just super useful. If you want to understand how a module works or what its input and output ports are, select it, press F1, all kinds of useful information. And for the modules that have other settings that you set up over here in the inspector, there's also documentation about what the inspector attributes are doing. And again, you can set them up in real time right here. Change the curve of these things, all kinds of stuff. And you can see that what I'm doing over in the inspector through this thing is actually affecting this diagram up here. It's affecting the module in real time. So this is just brilliant. This is the most, I earn a living as a technical writer in the software industry. And I'm amazed at this. This is such a brilliant approach to documentation and technical writing, to have these live modules with all the reference documentation built into this F1 help. It's marvelous. So take advantage of that. Okay, next thing that's useful is, let's say you're searching for a module, you can't remember what it is, and I'm pretty familiar with the grid now, so I know where to look for things, but it can be really bewildering at first. There's over 150 of these things. And where is it? What categorization it is under? But I know it's called random. So where the hell is random? Well, okay, that might be an easy one. Let's try a different one, like multiply. Where's multiply? Okay, so if I come up here to the search field and start typing multiply, hey, there it is, right? Or if I want to find modulator out, okay, there it is. Because a lot of times it can be hard to find it until you know exactly from muscle memory where it is. Another useful thing is you can be down here in the grid dragging things around and doing whatever, and just make sure your cursor isn't sitting on anything, and tap your S key and it will automatically put your focus up in the search field and you can start typing. So I can do S random, and I can say, yeah, I want a dice module. Let's drag that in here and hook it up to this gate. And then you can come over here and do S again and say, all right, let's look for merge. And okay, yeah, I want the stereo merge. So let's come over here and hook that to the input port of the audio output. And so it can be a very quick way to just, like, if you know the names of things or the partial name of things, use this S shortcut to get you up here into the search field and take advantage of that. Okay, 2 more things to go. Oh yeah, this is really useful. So you can have modulators that go from the outer parent device inside the grid and modulating things inside the grid, but you can also do it in the other direction, from things inside the grid that have wireless modulator arrows like these. You can have those affecting things outside of themselves on the parent container, or even on devices, now let's do FX, even on devices that might be inside these device containers inside the grid itself. Like, let's put an EQ here. Let's do EQ2. Okay, so we have an audio processing module inside the FX container of the grid device, right? And I want to take this value modulator and I want to have it affect the frequency of my low notch in this. And now, as I move the value scaler around, see how it's manipulating this frequency for the low? Let's turn it into a low pass. I'm sorry, high pass, right? Make it a little more obvious. All right, so we have a modulator, any one of them, any wireless modulator, affecting something in the parent device inside of the container, all in one. Now, you can also have typical modulators out here, like let's just put a macro button to keep it simple. And I can have a macro button on the parent container, macroing things inside the container, right? And if I stop that, start flipping the macro button around, you can see this changing, and you can see these 2 knobs changing. So I have something inside the grid that's already doing some modulation here, but then I also have this macro knob doing additional modulation to it, okay? So from the outside in and from the inside out. Anything that is either at the parent level, like let's take this LFO and let's also adjust the, I don't know, the output volume just a little bit, right? You can modulate anything from in to outer device or from outer device to inner device, and that includes other devices that are inside the containers of the entire parent grid device. And here you can see a roll-up of all the different modulations that are happening all around the grid device. And this can get a little confusing sometimes, right? So a trick for understanding this is to always just click on the specific thing that has modulations, and now it's limited to just the targets that those affect. And of course, like everywhere else, I can hover over this and you'll see a little blue highlight show up here to show that one of the things that's being modulated is this. And you're also going to see this highlight and this highlight as I hover over this arrow. So that's an easy way to tell, like, I have one specific wireless thing and I have tons and tons of modulations, but what is this in particular affecting, right? So that's that. And then the last trick, this one is super useful. I'm going to kind of reinitialize this grid to make it a little easier to see what I'm about to demo for you. Grid, poly. Okay. So here's a really, really typical use case that I think you'll find helpful. It's very, very common to build big, complex structures, and a lot of them are probably feeding into a mixer somewhere. Like, let's put some signals that are mixing into this envelope here. I'm going to bring in a few different oscillators. Let's bring in a sine. Let's say we're doing and let's replace this with a sawtooth. So let's say I have some sort of sawtooth shape, kind of higher pitched, and I want a sub happening on it. So I might kick this down to like 1/4. Okay, now right now I'm just hearing the high-pitched sawtooth. That's too high-pitched. I don't like buzzy things like that. Let's try that. Okay. Now if I want a sub layered with that, I would drop the sub into the mixer. And now you can hear I have a sub. Let's make it like that. And I can adjust the relative balance. So imagine that you've built this up and it's now way more complex and there's all kinds of other stuff going on, but at its heart, I still basically have two sounds that I'm bringing into the mixer, and I want to make it a little easier to see what's what, especially at the mixer. Like, I don't know, let's bring in another oscillator. Let's bring it down here. Let's just make this mixer a little more complex. Let's say I've got three things going on. And what I want to do is be able to tell at a glance, you know, have color coding showing me what's happening. So you can click on any given module, and up here you can choose colors. So let's say I'm going to make my sawtooth purple. I'm going to make my sine red, and I'm going to make my pulse green. Okay. And notice that these cables have changed color to match. And it's also changed the color of the knobs in the mixer. So now at a glance, I know that if I want to adjust the level of whatever is in my green sort of build, all the crazy stuff I'm doing to this pulse wave, you know, here's my mix for the green, here's my mix for the red, and so on. So this is really useful sometimes to like take entire, let's see, I'm trying to think of a simple use case here. Let's say I have an LFO doing some phase modulation, and I want this LFO to be purple too, to match the sawtooth, and so everything's like color-coded purple. So you're going to find yourself doing this a lot to keep things straight, is color-coding entire groups of things And at some point where you have a roll up, you want to have a mixer or something that's color coded and so on and so forth. Now, what you're going to find is if I put certain things in between the mixer and all my stuff that's color coded, like if I take a attenuate knob and I want to put it here, well, in this case, it is keeping the color. There's going to be cases where, oh, okay, I know a good use case. Let's say for whatever reason, we've put the mixer on the other side of the envelope. And let's say, for example, we have different envelopes for each one of our oscillators. And you can see that it's trying to color code things, right? But by default, this envelope was a different color than these. So you could try coming over here and, you know, making it match the color coding so that it flows all the way through. But if there are going to be cases, and I'm sorry, I'm struggling to find one right now that shows it, but there's going to be cases where the color gets kind of stuck and you can't change it. Maybe like a logic module, a select module. Let's see what happens if I use a selector here. Okay, so here's a good example. If I wanted to have two different signals coming into this select, yeah, okay, why not? Let's say I wanted to color code these all purple because they were all related somehow. And even this thing is purple. It helps if I actually grab purple. So everything here is sort of related in my build. And at one point, I'm making a decision to have a button toggle between either this chain, this signal chain on the bottom, or this signal chain on the top. You can see this little yellow indicator. The problem is in my mixer, you know, I've got other things hooked up to the mixer. My mixer is no longer, my mixer is no longer successfully color-coded, right? Because by the time I get to the mixer, it's just red because the select is red. Now, I could maybe change it to purple. Yeah, that works. But if for some reason you find something you hook up at the end that won't change color successfully, and there are some cases I've run into it, maybe that was a beta thing and they fixed it. But a trick you can use sometimes when you need to is you can take some sort of neutral knob like gain versus volume, right? And you can just drop it right in front of the input port and leave it at its neutral position so that it's not affecting the signal flow at all in any way. It's just completely transparent. And then usually you can take a knob like this and change its color to effectively change the color downstream in something like the mixer. So that's a potential trick to keep in mind for the future is if you can't directly color everything in a way that's useful for you, sometimes you can put in a neutral item like this in the signal path and change its color, and that will affect whatever might be blocking you. Then again, maybe it's not a problem anymore, so maybe I don't need to show you that shortcut, but I found it useful during a lot of the beta phases because there were times when I wanted to color code things and there'd be something that just wouldn't change color for me. Okay, so that's everything I have. Thanks for hanging out with me. That should give you all the basics for exploring the grid, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.